Sometimes when I'm researching a topic for the Raven's Eye, you find a story where it seems that everything that could possibly go wrong does indeed go wrong, resulting in just about the worst possible outcome. Every contributing factor seems to have either occurred in just exactly the wrong place or right at the worst possible moment. Today's story is one of those. I can clearly remember this accident when it occurred, as back in 2001 I was still in the north of England, and this happened not too far from where I was living at the time. In the early hours of the morning of February the 28th, 2001, 37-year-old builder Gary Hart was driving his Land Rover Defender westbound along the M62 motorway, towing a loaded car transport trailer behind him. After just 6 in the morning, as Hart was approaching junction 34 south of Selby, the Land Rover and trailer left the carriageway, crashing through a flimsy wooden fence and bouncing down a grassy railway embankment before coming to rest on the track below. Gary Hart, shaken but unhurt, tried in vain to reverse the Land Rover off the railway track, but as it became apparent that this was impossible, he exited the vehicle, dialling 999 for the emergency services on his mobile phone. Having got through to the operator, Hart shakily began to describe what had happened, but before he was able to do much other than describe the situation he found himself in, he heard the sound of an approaching train. The early morning Intercity 225 service from Newcastle, bound for London's King's Cross, had ploughed into Hart's Land Rover, completely ripping away the front part of the vehicle. Travelling at around 90 miles an hour, the train, consisting of a front and rear trailing engine with 9 passenger cars, had seemingly gone through the Land Rover as if it wasn't even there, remaining upright and on the track and continuing on southwards with no apparent damage. However, although the train had remained upright and on the track, its front 2 wheels had been derailed. A small detail maybe, but one which was to have deadly consequences in the following seconds. Brakes screeching, but moving under its own inertia, the still speeding express carried on down the southbound track, passing a set of points which gave access to a goods siding. The front 2 wheels, which were already derailed, were bumped up and over by the points, causing the Intercity 225 to jump the track over onto the northbound line, where, you guessed it, there was another train coming. The northbound train was a Freightliner goods train carrying some 1,800 tonnes of coal, bound for the nearby power station at Ferrybridge. This train was travelling at around 55 miles an hour. The combined speeds of the 2 trains moving in opposite directions resulted in a head-on collision of around 140 miles an hour, and the devastation was immediate and terrible. The forward engine car of the Intercity 225 was almost completely destroyed as it went under the freight locomotive. Behind, the first passenger coaches rode up into the air as the effect of the impact went through the still-moving train. The crash had unfortunately occurred directly underneath a road bridge, leading to increased damage to the passenger train, especially the first 3 carriages, some of which had their roofs sheared off as they collided with and tore along the underside of the bridge. By the time the Intercity 225 came to a halt, all 9 passenger cars had come off the rails, most of them jackknifing across the track or spilling over into the adjacent field. The force of the impact was so great that one carriage was thrown over 430 feet from the track. The freight train fared little better. The initial impact tore off the wheels of the engine as it rode up and over the Intercity cab, coal wagons spilled off to the side of the track, and the engine derailed completely, crushing an empty caravan that was parked alongside the railway line and crashing to a halt just a few feet from the nearest house. Emergency services were quickly on scene, but working in the twisted and torn wreckage was awkward to say the least. Helicopters were brought in to ferry the wounded to nearby hospitals, as many of these victims needed urgent medical assistance. The final tally: both drivers, 2 staff members and 6 first-class passengers were killed. 10 people dead and over 80 injured, many of them seriously. Looking at the wreckage, it's easy to imagine that the human cost could have been much, much greater. But fortunately, the early hour meant that the train was nowhere near its full passenger capacity. That, however, is just about the only positive factor in this tale. The rest of the story seems to have aligned like some sort of terrible synchronicity of bad luck. For example, Hart's Land Rover left the motorway in just exactly the worst possible location. Any earlier, he would have stopped before the railway line, and just a few feet further on, he would have hit the crash barriers and stayed on the motorway. Along the entire route of his journey, his car left the road at that exact spot, the one single place where he could have ended up on the railway line. Then the Intercity 225 arrived almost immediately afterwards, giving no time to get the car off the track. The set of points that was located just down the track, with no other points for miles in either direction, but of course it was these points which provided the nudge the train needed to jump the track. And of course, to cap it all off, there was an oncoming northbound freight train right at the precise moment that the Intercity left the track, and they collided under a bridge, maximising the damage to the passenger train. If any of these factors had been absent, it's possible that the damage and the casualties could have been much reduced. So, the one thing I haven't talked about, the elephant in the room, why did Gary Hart's Land Rover come off the M62 motorway in the first place? Well, initially Hart told investigators that he thought he hit something on the road, which caused some kind of steering problem, and he lost control of the car. The media reports of the time portrayed Hart in a sympathetic light. Wasn't he also a victim, an innocent man who would have to live with this unavoidable tragic accident for the rest of his life? After all, this could have happened to anyone, right? Well, not quite. As more details began to emerge over the following weeks, the public perception of Gary Hart began to shift radically. As the investigation into the rail crash deepened, it turned out that Hart hadn't suffered any kind of mechanical failure at all. He'd actually fallen asleep at the wheel, after having been up all night without any sleep. Hart described himself as having an unusual lifestyle, stating that he loved to live life at 1,000 miles an hour, and that on the morning of the accident he was buzzing, having spent all night chatting on the phone to a woman he'd met on an internet dating site. Being in the middle of a divorce from his wife, chatting to strangers on the internet all night and seemingly showing little remorse for what had happened did little to help Hart's public image. North Yorkshire police began putting together Gary Hart's movements prior to the accident. He'd been on the phone from 9:45 the previous evening until about 3:45 am, and was in the Land Rover and driving away by around 4:30 am. Hart told police that this wasn't unusual for him, and that he often went 36 hours or so without sleep, but that it wasn't a problem, he could handle it. He denied falling asleep at the wheel, but other motorists confirmed that they had seen Hart's Land Rover weaving around on the motorway in the early hours of February the 28th. Expert witnesses testified that Hart wouldn't have just fallen asleep with no warning, he would have been dozing on and off, and would have had plenty of warning that it was time to pull over and stop driving. To get to the scene of the accident by 6:13 am from Hart's house, police stated that Hart must have been driving, quote, like a bat out of hell. Hart's bragging about his ability to survive on just coffee for days at a stretch, and that how he was high on life and a modern-day hunter-gatherer did little to dispel the police's suspicions that Hart was unfit to drive that morning. Hart was charged with dangerous driving, and after a much publicised trial, was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Police described him as a mobile catastrophe waiting to happen, and that his reckless driving at high speed whilst he was dozing off was undoubtedly the ultimate cause of the Selby rail crash. Hart was released from prison after just 30 months. Relatives and campaigners were outraged that Hart was freed early, but this is seemingly standard practice in the British justice system, where convicted criminals often only serve half their sentence. Now, you might think that Hart would have preferred to slip quietly into anonymity, but his hour in the media spotlight seemed to have left a mark, and on the 10th anniversary of the crash, Hart gave an interview to a local radio station, whereupon he stated the following. "I believe in fate, and I was meant to be there that morning. The accident occurred because I was there, the same for the people that were on the train. They were meant to be there that morning. As far as being asleep at the wheel, that's what I went to prison for. It's not what the truth is. No deaths occurred at the point of impact with my Land Rover. They all occurred 700 yards down the track, which I feel other people should have been held accountable for. So, in my own head, I've dealt with it. I've absolved myself, not of responsibility, but of knowing anything about the victims. That would degenerate my life into misery. I survived this accident, and I want to survive the rest of my life. Unsurprisingly, Hart's comments did not go down well with the families of the victims, nor with some of the wounded survivors who are still living with the life-changing injuries to this day. After all, for many of those involved in the Selby rail crash, forgiving yourself and deciding to move on with your life just simply isn't a viable option.